There has. It was a slightly delayed announcement by a couple of weeks, I think, mostly to allow Student Finance England and Student Finance Wales to further assess the applications that they've received. There were no rounds of clarification questions that went back to the bidders that we're aware of. But there were substantial volumes of questions that were asked in the lead up to the submission. Far more than I believe is normal, just to really to establish all of the criteria that the student finance were looking to fulfill. So yeah, there was a slight delay, but the bidders have now been notified as to whether they were successful or otherwise, and the tender documentation has now been issued. So this is relatively very commercially sensitive for obviously a number of the bidders. So a certain amount of what we've heard firsthand, we know it to be fact. Other bits we've heard sort of through the grapevine, and because of the way that Chinese whispers work, I won't quote any facts around this because I don't want to mislead or sort of impact on any commercial conversations that are going on out there. However, what I do believe, and I don't think this is speaking out of school, is that all of the current ATSPs have made it through to the next round on either one or more bids. In terms of the assessment centres, there were several that attached themselves to bids. By no means not all, and obviously a lot of the independent assessment centres are looking at their options moving forwards, and the same goes for the independent training companies and how they've attached themselves either as named bidding partners or unnamed bidding partners, and that sort of will probably flesh out over the coming weeks whilst the bids are being fully constructive. So a little bit of work to be done there in terms of who's through at the moment. But in terms of any surprises, I think one of the biggest surprises, given the size of the tender, there were a couple of companies, the very large IT outsourcing companies like Atos, who didn't submit a bid. They looked at the work that was required and the requirements of SFE and SFW, and couldn't easily put together both a commercial and practical way of justifying and providing that equipment, and those services. So yeah, there were some surprises in terms of those bids not going forwards, and I believe there are some of those larger companies who did not make it through to the next round. Equally surprising, I must say. Yeah, that's a super good question. I mean, really, there's a couple of key things that they want to see put in place. Contracts and very structured commercial arrangements with the funding bodies and with the providers is one of those key aspects. They also want to see financial stability across the market, and personally, I think they were hoping to see probably more of the very large outsourcing companies or very large IT companies supporting those bids. And I believe from what's gone through at the moment, that isn't always the case, which I think is great. I think that, there is a huge amount of experience and skills out there. And I'm very, very pleased to see that a lot of that has gone through without sort of having to manage and deal with those large outsourcing companies who don't really know the ins and outs of this sector and the nuances of how it's provided. So I'm really pleased to see that those consortiums that I'm aware of look really well structured and going to give a great sort of scope of skill, experience, stability. So yes, I think they probably have satisfied their aims largely, maybe not quite in the way they expected, but given the size of the bids that are through that we're aware of, there's a lot of built-in redundancy there. There's a lot of stability there. Yeah, I think it's looking pretty good for those who are successful, obviously. A very tricky question to answer, but yes, I think we have got a mix of both. We have got the companies that are actively either leading on a bid or named participants within a bid. We believe there are 9, maybe 10 bids through to the next stage. And that is obviously a very formalized structure between them. But I think that in order to deliver the capacity, certainly in the short term, there is going to be a significant role for subcontractors, and whether that's as assessors, as equipment suppliers, as trainers. And it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over the duration of the contract. We believe it's going to be a 3-year contract initially, with the option to extend for 12 or 24 months. So I think there will be movements. I think equally, we're in a position now that although the bidding groups, consortiums have been notified they are successful, there are obviously some that aren't, and there may well be some movements in terms of additions to those bidding groups or substitutions within those bidding groups, depending on the partners that are now available. Of course, all of those have to improve the bid. You can't just swap somebody out for say, for example, cheaper but not as proficient. So they all need to be justified back to the awarding body to make sure that what they're now going to submit marries up to what they've submitted already. So yeah, I think quite a lot of people, in the same way that Access to Work works at the moment, they are sort of strong in the belief that subcontract will be an option moving forwards, and it will of course help with managing the peaks and troughs of demand as we go across the academic year, which is very seasonal. So yeah, there's an interesting mix, but with that capacity in mind, yes, I think there will be definitely a role for subcontracting, either for individuals or organizations. So the tender documentation has been issued, and I'm quite sure all the bidding parties are working their way through that. I've had a look through myself. It makes for an interesting read. There aren't that many surprises in there in terms of what was issued prior to this to what has now been issued. It all seems to be largely in line. The big thing for the next few weeks are going to be the clarification questions, and I know there were some questions in the previous rounds, the selection questionnaire round, that some people didn't feel were quite answered in depth enough to actually give a commercial response to. So I know there's going to be some interesting questions raised that will need to be nailed down for the next round. So questions now up until the 5th of August, which isn't long. It's only 2 weeks really from now to issue those clarification questions. Those should all be answered by about the 12th of August. And then the most sort of exciting point at this point is the bid submission deadline, which is noon on the 30th of August. So yeah, it's going to be a busy summer for quite a number of parties in the sector. That's a big ask, 6 weeks to put those sort of constructs together, to document everything and how you're going to deliver it is a big challenge. We believe that there then will be bidder presentations based on, well, potentially based on a shortlist. Potentially it will be all bidders. We're not entirely clear on that at the moment. And then when the evaluations are complete, the recommended suppliers will receive their awards and notifications. And again, we assume that the unsuccessful bidders will also be notified, and that will be at the end of November. Then, of course, there's always a standstill period during which there's always the opportunity for challenges to the decisions. But then, yeah, mid-December is really when we're looking for the final sign-off on those contracts, if it all goes according to plan. As I mentioned the last time we spoke, one of the big differences we're seeing with this tender exercise that is different to the previous tender exercises that were aborted is that they are much more keen to get it right than they are to deliver it on time. So I wouldn't be surprised if those timescales do slip slightly to enable the right answers to be given and the right sort of stages to have gone through in full effect, rather than rushing it just to hit a deadline, which I think makes a huge amount of sense and is very welcome.